On a cool October morning in 1886, a track-laying crew working the final stretch of the Kansas and Gulf Railroad near the Arkansas-Oklahoma border made a discovery that would haunt the territory for generations. They had been blasting through a limestone ridge, carving a path for the iron horse that would soon connect the cattle markets of Fort Worth to the wheat fields of Kansas. The foreman, a weathered Irishman named Patrick O'Malley, had ordered his men to clear the debris from the morning's explosion when one of the laborers called out in a voice trembling with something more than exhaustion. The bones were not old. They were not animal. And they were not alone. The crew uncovered what appeared to be the remains of at least a dozen men, buried in a shallow grave no more than 3 feet beneath the surface. The bodies had been stripped of their clothing, their boots, their belts, everything that could identify them or be sold. Some had their hands bound behind their backs. Several showed evidence of gunshot wounds to the back of the skull. One, the foreman noted with a peculiar kind of horror, had been buried with his eyes still open, the sockets filled with the red clay of the territory. The discovery might have been a simple tragedy, one of the countless murders that plagued the Indian Territory in those lawless years. But what made the find truly disturbing was the number of bodies. The crew counted 12. And then they counted again. And again. 12 men, buried in a mass grave, alongside the tracks of a railroad that was supposed to bring civilization to the frontier. But here is the part that no one could explain. According to the official records of the Kansas and Gulf Railroad, the track-laying crew that had been assigned to that section of the line had exactly 30 men. The payroll records were meticulous, the work orders precise. The company knew exactly how many men they had sent into the territory. They knew their names, their ages, their families, their wages. They had sent 30 men. And now 12 were dead. But when the bodies were identified, when the survivors were counted and the missing were tallied, something strange emerged. The dead were not part of the work crew. They were something else entirely. And somewhere in the hills of the Indian Territory, in the autumn of 1886, a crew of 30 men had returned from their work with exactly 30 men accounted for. Not a single one missing. Not a single one dead. So who were the 12? And why had they been buried beneath the railroad tracks? The answer, as I discovered after months of research in the archives of Fort Smith, in the dusty records of the Choctaw Nation, and in the faded pages of frontier newspapers, would lead me deep into the heart of one of the most remarkable and forgotten stories of the American frontier. It is a story of violence and redemption, of law and lawlessness, of the collision of cultures and the birth of a nation. It is a story that begins, as so many stories do, with the railroad. The Indian Territory, in the years following the Civil War, was a place of extraordinary contradiction. It was, legally speaking, not a territory of the United States in the ordinary sense. It was a patchwork of sovereign nations, the lands of the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, who had been forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands in the Southeast decades earlier. The treaties they had signed with the federal government guaranteed their sovereignty, their right to govern themselves, their right to live free from the interference of white settlers. But the treaties were written on paper, and the hunger for land and wealth was written in blood. By the 1880s, the Indian Territory was being carved up by forces far more powerful than tribal law. The railroads, those great iron arteries of American expansion, were pushing into the territory from every direction. The Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, known simply as the Katy, had crossed into the territory in 1870, following a route that would eventually connect St. Louis to Galveston. The Fort Smith and Southern Railway was pushing west from Arkansas. And the Kansas and Gulf Railroad was driving south from Kansas, cutting through the heart of the Choctaw Nation. The railroad companies had a powerful ally in Washington. The federal government, eager to open the Indian Territory to settlement and development, had granted the railroads extensive rights-of-way through tribal lands. The tribes had protested, had appealed to the courts, had even appealed to the president himself. But the railroad men had one thing that the tribes did not: the backing of the United States Army. The soldiers stationed at Fort Smith, Fort Gibson, and the other military posts scattered across the territory were there to keep the peace. But they were also there to protect the railroad. And protecting the railroad, in the minds of the military commanders, meant protecting the railroad's interests, regardless of tribal sovereignty or tribal law. The construction of the railroads brought money into the territory, and money brought lawlessness. The towns that sprang up along the tracks, and there were many of them, some of them built overnight, became magnets for every kind of vice and violence imaginable. Gambling dens, saloons, brothels. And at the heart of it all, a steady stream of men desperate for work, willing to do anything for a day's wages. The work was brutal. The railroad companies pushed their crews to the breaking point, demanding mile after mile of track laid in conditions that would have seemed barbaric even by the standards of the 19th century. The laborers, mostly Irish immigrants, freedmen, and poor white men from the border states, worked from dawn to dusk, swinging sledgehammers, hauling rail, laying ties. The pay was barely enough to keep a man alive, and the living conditions were worse than anything most of them had ever known. And then there were the diseases. The Indian Territory was known as a place of fever and ague, where malaria and yellow fever struck with terrifying speed. The workers slept in tents or in crude shelters, often in the open, exposed to the elements and to the clouds of mosquitoes that rose from the swamps at dusk. A crew of 50 men could be reduced to 20 in a matter of weeks. But disease, as terrible as it was, could be explained. What happened at the Limestone Ridge that October morning in 1886 could not. To understand what happened at the Limestone Ridge, we must go back 3 months, to the summer of 1886, and to a man named Elias Whitfield. Elias Whitfield was a Choctaw interpreter, one of the few men in the territory who could move freely between the world of the tribes and the world of the white settlers. He had been born in the Choctaw Nation, had been educated in the missionary schools that dotted the territory, and had learned English well enough to pass as white when it suited his purposes. He had worked for the railroad as a translator, helping to negotiate rights-of-way with tribal leaders, and had seen enough of the railroad men to know that they were not to be trusted. The railroad people, he would later tell a magistrate in Fort Smith, they speak one way to the chiefs and another way to the men with the money. They promise one thing and deliver another. And they think nothing of it. Elias had left the railroad's employ in the spring of 1886, disillusioned and, he admitted, a little frightened. He had seen things that he was not meant to see. He had heard things that he was not meant to hear. And he had decided, wisely, that the best course of action was to disappear into the hills until the work was finished. But Elias Whitfield was not the kind of man who could stay quiet about what he had seen. He was a man of conscience, a man who believed in justice, a man who had been raised in the traditions of his people and who remembered what it meant to live under the threat of violence. And what he had seen, he could not forget. It began, as so many of the tragedies of the frontier began, with money. The Choctaw Nation had signed a treaty with the railroad, granting the Kansas and Gulf the right to build a line through their lands in exchange for a substantial sum and the promise of ongoing payments. The treaty was supposed to be a fair one, negotiated by the Tribal Council with the assistance of the federal Indian agent assigned to the Choctaw Nation. But the Indian agent was a man named Horace B. Treadwell, and Horace B. Treadwell was a thief. Treadwell had been appointed to his position by the president, as was customary in those days, and he had arrived in the Choctaw Nation with all the enthusiasm of a man who had been given a license to steal. He had made a fortune off his position, pocketing payments that were meant for the tribes, selling licenses to traders who had no business being in the territory, and generally enriching himself at the expense of the people he was supposed to protect. The railroad, seeing an opportunity, had made Treadwell an offer he could not refuse. In exchange for his assistance in securing the right-of-way and keeping the tribal leaders compliant, the railroad would pay him a percentage of the construction costs. It was a simple arrangement, the kind of corruption that was common on the frontier. The railroad got what it wanted, Treadwell got what he wanted, and the Choctaw Nation got the shaft. But there was a problem. The Choctaw were not as compliant as Treadwell and the railroad had anticipated. The Tribal Council, led by a chief named Benjamin Franklin Smallwood, had begun to suspect that something was wrong. The payments from the railroad were smaller than they should have been. The rights-of-way were wider than the treaty allowed. And the railroad men were beginning to talk about extending the line into lands that had not been included in the agreement. Smallwood had sent a petition to Washington, detailing the irregularities and demanding an investigation. And the railroad, fearing that the investigation would expose their arrangement with Treadwell, had decided to take matters into their own hands. In July of 1886, a meeting was held at a trading post near the town of Caddo, in the heart of the Choctaw Nation. The meeting was supposed to be about the railroad's plans for the coming year, about the route the line would take and the towns that would be built along the way. The tribal council had been invited, and Chief Smallwood had agreed to attend. But when Smallwood and his delegation arrived at the trading post, they found more than railroad officials. They found the Indian agent, Horace Treadwell, accompanied by two men who were clearly not part of the railroad's regular crew. One of the men, a tall, thin figure with a scar running down his cheek, was introduced as a representative of the federal government, sent to assist with the negotiations. The other man said nothing. He stood in the shadows, watching, his hands never straying far from the revolver at his hip. Elias Whitfield was at the meeting, serving as an interpreter for the Choctaw delegation. He would later describe the atmosphere as tense, with the railroad officials barely concealing their impatience and the Choctaw leaders clearly uncomfortable. Smallwood had brought a list of complaints, a careful accounting of the railroad's failures to abide by the treaty, and he read them out in a clear, steady voice. The railroad officials listened with visible frustration. When Smallwood had finished, the scarred man spoke. "The railroad has done everything required by the treaty," he said. "The payments have been made. The rights-of-way have been established. The line is proceeding according to schedule. If you have complaints, you may address them through the proper channels." Smallwood responded with dignity, pointing out that the proper channels were controlled by Treadwell, who was clearly in the railroad's pocket. The tension in the room increased, and Elias, standing to one side, noticed that the silent man had moved closer to the door. "There will be no investigation," the scarred man said. "The railroad has the full support of the federal government. Any attempt to interfere with the construction will be met with the full force of the law." Smallwood was not intimidated. He stood up, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "The law," he said, "is what we make it. And the law of the Choctaw Nation is clear. The railroad must abide by the treaty, or it will not be allowed to proceed." The meeting ended shortly thereafter, with no resolution reached. Smallwood and his delegation left the trading post, their faces grim. Elias Whitfield remained behind, waiting for the other men to depart. He wanted to speak with the railroad officials privately, to see if there was any way to bridge the gap between the two sides. He never got the chance. As he was waiting, he overheard the scarred man speaking with Treadwell in low, urgent tones. "Smallwood is a problem," the scarred man said. "He's stirring up trouble, and he's not going to stop until someone stops him." "What are you suggesting?" Treadwell asked. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what needs to be done. If Smallwood continues to interfere, the railroad's timeline will be compromised. And if the timeline is compromised, the railroad will look for someone to blame. You understand what that means for you?" Treadwell was silent for a moment. "Yes," he said finally. "I understand." Elias Whitfield left the trading post that day with a cold knot in his stomach. He knew, with the certainty of a man who has seen the worst of what humans can do to each other, that something terrible was about to happen. On the night of August 15, 1886, Chief Benjamin Franklin Smallwood vanished. He had been traveling home from a meeting of the tribal council, accompanied by his nephew and two bodyguards. The party had made camp near the banks of the Kiamishi River, in a secluded spot that Smallwood had used many times before. The next morning, a passing hunter found the camp abandoned. The fire had been extinguished, but the remains of the evening meal were still sitting on the cook fire. The horses were still tied to the trees. And in the center of the camp, carefully arranged in a pattern that would have been visible from above, was a message. It was a simple message, written in the dirt with a stick. But its meaning was chilling: no investigation. Smallwood and his companions were never seen again. No bodies were recovered. No trace of their fate was ever found. They simply disappeared, as if the earth itself had swallowed them. The Choctaw Nation was thrown into chaos. Without Smallwood's leadership, the council was divided, uncertain of how to proceed. Some wanted to appeal to Washington, to demand that the president send an investigator to look into the disappearance. Others, more cynical, pointed out that Smallwood had been a vocal opponent of the railroad, and that the timing of his disappearance was more than coincidental. Elias Whitfield knew exactly what had happened. He had heard the scarred man's warning at the trading post, and he knew that the railroad was capable of anything. But he also knew that he had no proof. His word against the word of the railroad officials, against the word of the Indian agent, against the word of the federal government. It would be suicide to speak out. And so Elias Whitfield did what so many men on the frontier did when faced with impossible choices. He kept his mouth shut. He returned to his farm, a small plot of land near the town of Eufaula, and he tried to forget what he had seen. But forgetting, as he would soon learn, was not an option. The disappearance of Chief Smallwood was not the only crime that went unpunished in the Indian Territory in the summer of 1886. In fact, it was barely a footnote in the local newspapers, which were full of stories of violence and lawlessness. A man could be shot in the street in broad daylight, and the newspapers would devote a paragraph to the event, sandwiched between advertisements for patent medicines and articles about the price of cattle. But the railroad secret, the secret that Elias Whitfield had stumbled upon, was more than just a crime. It was a conspiracy of silence, an understanding between the railroad men, the politicians, and the law that the construction of the iron road was more important than justice. The railroad, you see, needed workers. It needed hundreds of workers, thousands of workers, men who would toil in the heat and the mud, men who would swing sledgehammers and haul rail and lay ties until their hands bled and their backs gave out. And the railroad, like every other railroad in the country, was willing to do whatever it took to get those workers. In the Indian Territory, that meant bending the law. The treaties that governed the territory had strict provisions about the hiring of tribal members for work on the railroads. The tribes were supposed to be compensated fairly for their labor, and they were supposed to be protected from exploitation. But the provisions were meaningless if no one enforced them. The railroad had a system. They would bring in workers from outside the territory, men who were desperate enough to take any work, men who had no connections and no protections. They would pay them a pittance, work them until they collapsed, and then discard them when they were no longer useful. And if a worker complained, if he tried to organize, if he threatened to expose the railroad's practices, he would be dealt with. The Limestone Ridge was not the only mass grave in the Indian Territory. But it was the only one that had been discovered. In September of 1886, something happened that forced the railroad's secret into the light. A fire broke out at the Kansas and Gulf's main supply depot, a sprawling complex of warehouses and bunkhouses near the town of Topeka. The fire burned for 3 days, destroying everything in its path. The railroad claimed it was an accident, a careless worker who had dropped a lantern. But the workers knew better. The fire was no accident. It was an act of desperation, an attempt by the laborers to destroy the evidence of their exploitation. And when the fire was finally put out, when the ashes had cooled and the investigators had picked through the debris, they found something that the railroad had hoped would never be found. The paybooks. The payroll records. The contracts. They were all there, charred but readable, a testament to the railroad's systematic abuse of its workers. The paybooks showed that many of the laborers were being paid less than the agreed-upon wage. The contracts showed that many of them had signed agreements that were clearly illegal. But most damning of all were the missing workers. The paybooks had a list of men who had been hired and then disappeared, their names crossed out with a single slash. There were dozens of them, men who had been assigned to work on the line and then simply vanished. No notice of termination. No record of payment. No mention of what had happened to them. The railroad claimed that the men had quit, had walked off the job. But the workers knew better. They knew that the men who had crossed the railroad had not quit. They had been killed. Elias Whitfield, hearing about the fire and the discovery of the paybooks, decided that he could not stay silent any longer. He had seen the bones. He had heard the rumors. He had spoken to other workers, men who had survived their time with the railroad, men who had stories that would make your blood run cold. He went to the sheriff, a man named Ulysses S. Grant, no relation to the president but just as committed to the rule of law. Grant listened to Elias's story with a grave expression, nodding at the appropriate moments, asking questions when something was unclear. When Elias had finished, Grant leaned back in his chair and sighed. "I believe you," he said. "I believe every word you've said. But I can't do anything about it." "Why not?" Elias demanded. "It's your job to enforce the law." "The law," Grant said, "is what the federal government says it is. And the federal government says that the railroad is to be protected. If I arrest a railroad man, if I bring him to trial, the army will be here within a week. They'll arrest me for interfering with a federal project. And then where will I be?" Elias sat in stunned silence. He had grown up believing that the law was the law, that justice would prevail. But the sheriff's words, cynical as they were, rang true. "Get out of the territory, Elias," Grant said. "Get out while you still can. The railroad men are not done with you. They know you were at the trading post. They know you heard what was said. And they know you've been asking questions. You're a danger to them, and they will not tolerate that." Elias Whitfield left the sheriff's office with a heavy heart. He knew that the sheriff was right. The railroad men would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. They had already killed Chief Smallwood. They had already killed a dozen men and buried them in a mass grave. Elias was just another loose end, waiting to be tied up. He went back to his farm and began to pack. He had a sister in the Choctaw Nation, a place called Eufaula, where she lived with her husband and children. He would go there, lay low, and wait for the storm to pass. But the storm was already upon him. As he was loading his wagon, he saw a cloud of dust on the road leading to his farm. A group of men were coming, riding hard, and Elias knew instantly who they were. He ran for the house, grabbed his rifle, and took cover behind a stack of hay bales. The men came to a halt about 50 yards from the house, their horses snorting and stamping. There were 5 of them, led by a tall, thin figure with a scar on his cheek. Elias Whitfield, the scarred man, called out, "We know you're in there. Come out, and we'll let you live." Elias didn't answer. He aimed his rifle at the scarred man, his hands steady despite his racing heart. He was a good shot, had been hunting since he was a boy, and he knew that he could hit his target from this distance. But there were 5 of them, and only one of him. If he fired, he would kill one of them, maybe 2. But the rest would close in and finish him. And his wife and children were in the house. "Please," he called out. "My family is here. Let them go, and I'll do whatever you want." The scarred man laughed. "Your family is the least of your concerns, Elias. You should have kept your mouth shut. But you didn't. And now you have to pay the price." Elias fired. The shot took the scarred man in the chest, sending him tumbling from his horse. The other men scattered, taking cover behind trees and rocks. Elias fired again, aiming at the rider on the left, but the shot went wide. And then the fire. He could smell it, a sharp chemical smell that made his eyes water. They had set fire to the barn, and the flames were spreading to the house. Elias ran, his lungs filling with smoke, but he couldn't find his family. He was the only one who made it out alive. The house burned to the ground, and the bodies of his wife and children were found in the ruins the next day. The local authorities ruled it an accident, a candle that had been left unattended. But Elias knew the truth. The railroad men had killed them, and they would kill him too if they had the chance. He fled the territory that night, following the road south to Texas, where he hoped to find safety. Elias Whitfield didn't stop running until he reached the town of Paris, Texas. There, he found work as a farmhand, living in a small cabin on the outskirts of town. He kept his head down, made no trouble, and tried to forget the horrors he had witnessed. But he couldn't forget. The faces of his wife and children haunted his dreams, and the memory of the scarred man's laughter echoed in his ears. He knew that he would never be safe until the railroad men were brought to justice. And so, in January of 1887, Elias Whitfield did something that would change his life forever. He went to Fort Smith and he told his story to a federal judge. The judge's name was Isaac C. Parker. He was known as the hanging judge, because of his willingness to sentence convicted criminals to death. Parker was a legend, a figure of immense authority who had presided over thousands of cases and had sent dozens of men to the gallows. He had no patience for criminals, and he had even less patience for men who tried to subvert the law. Elias Whitfield told Parker everything. He told him about the meeting at the trading post, about the scarred man and the Indian agent, about the disappearance of Chief Smallwood. He told him about the paybooks and the missing workers. He told him about the mass grave at the Limestone Ridge. And he told him about the deaths of his wife and children. Parker listened without interrupting, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. When Elias had finished, the judge sat in silence for a long moment. "You have done a brave thing," Parker said finally. "You have come forward with evidence that implicates some of the most powerful men in the territory. There are those who would see you dead for what you have done." Elias nodded. "I know," he said. "But I can't live with this anymore. I can't let them get away with what they've done." Parker stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered streets of Fort Smith. "What they have done," he said quietly, "is the worst kind of evil. They have taken the law into their own hands. They have killed with impunity. And they have corrupted the very institutions that were meant to protect the innocent." He turned back to face Elias. "I will issue a warrant. I will order the arrest of every man implicated in this conspiracy. And I will not rest until justice is done." Judge Parker's investigation began in February of 1887, with the arrest of Horace B. Treadwell, the Indian agent. Treadwell was brought to Fort Smith in chains, protesting his innocence loudly and consistently. He claimed that he had no knowledge of the crimes, that he was just a government official trying to do his job. But the evidence was overwhelming. The paybooks, which had been recovered from the burned depot, showed that Treadwell had received thousands of dollars in bribes from the railroad. The contracts, which had been signed by Treadwell himself, showed that he had knowingly approved illegal labor arrangements. And the witnesses, dozens of them, all told the same story. Treadwell was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to life in prison. He died in a federal penitentiary in 1892, a broken man, his reputation destroyed. The railroad officials proved to be more difficult to prosecute. They had deep pockets and powerful friends in Washington, and they fought the charges with every legal maneuver at their disposal. But Parker was relentless. He issued warrants for the arrest of the company's senior officials, and he threatened to haul them before his court in chains if they refused to cooperate. The railroad eventually settled, agreeing to pay substantial compensation to the families of the victims and to reform its labor practices in the Indian Territory. It was not justice, not truly. The men who had ordered the murders were never punished. They were protected by the same system that had allowed them to commit their crimes. But the case did change things. It exposed the corruption at the heart of the Indian Territory's administration, and it led to reforms that improved the lives of the workers who built the railroads. And it taught the tribes that they could fight back, that they could appeal to the law and, sometimes, win. The bodies found at the Limestone Ridge were eventually identified, or at least some of them were. They were not, as the railroad had claimed, workers who had died of natural causes. They were men who had crossed the railroad, men who had spoken out against the injustice they had witnessed. One of them was a man named John Henry, an African-American laborer from Texas. He had been assigned to work on the track-laying crew, and he had witnessed the murder of Chief Smallwood. He had told his employer what he had seen, and the employer had told the railroad. John Henry was dead within a week. Another was a man named William Smith, a Choctaw interpreter who had been present at the meeting in Caddo. He had heard the scarred man's warning, and he had understood what it meant. He had tried to warn Chief Smallwood, but it was too late. He died along with the chief, his body buried alongside the tracks. They were all buried in the same place, their hands bound behind their backs, their eyes open, their mouths filled with red clay. They were the forgotten men, the ones who had been destroyed by a system that valued profit over human life. Elias Whitfield's testimony was crucial in identifying them. He knew their names, their stories, their faces. And he had made it his mission to ensure that they were not forgotten. He lived for many years after his testimony, never returning to the Indian Territory, but never forgetting what he had seen. He died in Texas in 1910, a respected member of his community, a man who had risked everything for the truth. His gravestone bears a simple epitaph. Here lies Elias Whitfield, who spoke for those who could not speak. He lived for justice, and he died in peace. In the decades that followed, the railroad lines that had been built through the Indian Territory became part of a larger system, the routes that connected the scattered settlements of the frontier to the growing cities of the East. The tracks that had once been laid by suffering and death were now traversed by trains carrying passengers and freight, a symbol of progress and prosperity. The Limestone Ridge where the bodies were found was bypassed by a new line, its location all but forgotten. The tracks that once stood there were pulled up and replaced with a spur that led to a small village that had, by then, become a ghost town. The ridge itself was overgrown with brush and trees, indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. But the bones, they say, are still there. Buried beneath the earth, their spirits restless and unfulfilled. For years, the people of the area told stories about the ridge. They said that on certain nights, when the moon is full and the wind is still, you can hear the sound of sledgehammers and shouting, the ghosts of the railroad workers still laboring on the line. Some claim to have seen the spectral figures of men in chains, walking along the tracks, their faces hidden in shadow. I don't believe in ghosts, not in the traditional sense. But I do believe in history. And I believe that some stories, like the story of the forgotten men buried beneath the tracks, refuse to be forgotten. The official records of the Kansas and Gulf Railroad were destroyed in a fire in 1893, the same year that the company was absorbed into the larger Missouri-Kansas-Texas system. The documents that survived, the ones that are preserved in the archives of the National Archives and the University of Oklahoma, are fragmentary and incomplete. They tell us that a crew of 30 men was assigned to work on the line near the Limestone Ridge in October of 1886. They tell us that the crew returned from their work with exactly 30 men accounted for. But they don't tell us who the dead men were. They don't tell us who the survivors were. And they don't tell us how 12 men who were never part of any official crew, came to be buried beneath the tracks of a railroad that was supposed to bring civilization to the frontier. The records are silent on all of these points. And so the mystery remains. The bones were found by a railroad crew in October of 1886. They were reburied nearby, in a small cemetery that has since been abandoned. The headstones, if there ever were any, are long gone. But the story persists. The story of the 12 men who died beneath the tracks. The story of Chief Smallwood, the leader who dared to challenge the railroad. The story of Elias Whitfield, the man who risked everything to speak the truth. And at the end of it all, one question still haunts me. If the railroad crew of 1886 returned with exactly 30 men accounted for, where did the dead men come from? And whose names were crossed off those payroll records in the burned depot, not written, simply crossed out, as if they never existed? Those are questions I cannot answer. And perhaps, when it comes to the forgotten frontier, we are not meant to know. Perhaps some graves are meant to stay hidden. And some stories are too dark to ever be fully told.